My fiancé's parents demanded I give them half my business in prenup, my wedding day contract. The morning of my wedding, I sat in the bridal suite at Napa Valley's most exclusive winery, watching my future in-laws frantically sign documents that would change everything. They had no idea what they were actually agreeing to. Let me back up 3 months. I'm 31, own a cybersecurity firm that I built from scratch after dropping out of Stanford, and I was supposed to marry the woman of my dreams in front of 200 guests. Sarah came from old California money, the kind of family that owned vineyards before Napa was trendy, who summered in Martha's Vineyard and wintered in Aspen. Her parents, Richard and Margaret Whitmore, treated me like hired help despite my company being worth 8 figures. The bombshell dropped on a Tuesday evening at their Atherton mansion. I'd driven up from San Francisco in my Tesla, expecting our usual awkward small talk over Margaret's overpriced wine collection. Instead, Richard ambushed me with manila folders and a smirk that made my stomach turn. The prenup they wanted me to sign wasn't just about protecting Sarah's family assets, it was a complete takeover of my business. 50% ownership would transfer to them immediately upon marriage, supposedly held in trust for Sarah's protection. They claimed it was standard practice for wealthy families, delivered with the kind of condescending tone that suggested I wouldn't understand such sophisticated financial planning. I stared at the documents, my hands actually shaking. This wasn't love or protection. This was calculated theft wrapped in legal terminology. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled, waiting for me to cave to their pressure. Margaret sipped her Bordeaux like we were discussing the weather. Updated. Hey everyone, thanks for the overwhelming response to my story. Just wanted to clarify. Yes, this really happened exactly as I'm telling it. Some of you asked if I suspected something beforehand. Honestly, no. The signs were there, but I was blinded by love. Should I have seen this coming from people who treated service staff like dirt? The worst part wasn't the audacity of their demand. It was Sarah's reaction when I brought it up later that night. She knew. She'd known for weeks and hadn't warned me. Her exact words were that her parents were just being cautious, that I should understand their position given my background. My background, like being a self-made millionaire, was somehow shameful compared to inherited wealth. I told them I needed time to review with my attorney, which bought me exactly what I needed. Enough space to investigate why they suddenly wanted control of my company. What I discovered made my blood boil. The Whitmores weren't just protective parents. They were desperate ones. 3 months of digging through public records, business filings, and some discreet conversations with mutual acquaintances painted a very different picture than their carefully maintained facade. Richard's commercial real estate empire had been hemorrhaging money for 2 years. Bad investments in retail properties right before e-commerce exploded, over-leveraged purchases that couldn't generate sufficient rental income, and a spectacular failure trying to develop luxury condos in San Jose that nobody wanted. The family's liquid assets had evaporated faster than morning fog in Napa. Their Atherton mansion carried a second mortgage. The Martha's Vineyard house was in foreclosure proceedings that they'd managed to keep quiet. Even the vintage Porsche collection that Richard loved showing off was financed to the hilt. They were house-rich and cash-poor, maintaining appearances while frantically searching for a financial lifeline. Enter me, the perfect mark. A successful tech entrepreneur with no family connections to protect me, dating their daughter who'd been primed to see their demands as reasonable. They'd probably been planning this approach since Sarah and I got serious, viewing our relationship as a business opportunity rather than their daughter's happiness. Sarah's complicity cut deeper than her parents' greed. She'd grown up expecting a certain lifestyle, and my success represented security for maintaining that standard. When I pressed her about the prenup, she became defensive, suggesting I was being paranoid and ungrateful for her family's acceptance. Acceptance, as if their tolerance was some precious gift I should treasure. The manipulation was sophisticated and long-term. They'd spent months positioning themselves as reluctant participants in necessary financial planning, making me feel like the unreasonable one for questioning their motives. Classic gaslighting wrapped in expensive suits and served with premium wine. I realized I had 2 choices. Walk away from someone I'd planned to spend my life with, or find a way to turn their own strategy against them. My attorney, David Chen, has handled deals worth hundreds of millions and rarely shows emotion. When I explained the Whitmore's prenup demand, he actually laughed out loud before calling it the most brazen attempted theft he'd encountered in 20 years of practice. We spent 2 weeks crafting our response. Not the document they expected, my signature on their terms, but something far more interesting. A comprehensive liability waiver and financial responsibility agreement that would make them think twice about their strategy. The genius was in the presentation. I scheduled a meeting at their mansion, arriving with professional document folders that looked identical to what they'd presented me. I even used the same legal stationery format to maintain consistency. Richard and Margaret settled into their usual positions of assumed authority, ready to witness my capitulation to their demands. Instead, I presented them with detailed financial disclosures about their current situation. Bank statements, foreclosure notices, credit reports, everything their private investigator had helped me compile. The color drained from their faces as they realized I knew exactly what they were attempting and why. But I wasn't done. The second folder contained my counteroffer. If they wanted to tie their family's financial future to my business success, they could do so by accepting full personal liability for any losses my company might sustain. Every dollar of debt, every potential lawsuit, every business risk would become their responsibility in exchange for any ownership stake. The third folder contained the real surprise, a detailed analysis of their daughter's spending habits and financial expectations. Sarah's credit card statements told an interesting story about someone who'd never learned the value of money, running up six-figure balances on luxury items while her parents' empire crumbled around them. Richard's composure finally cracked. The man who'd spent months talking down to me suddenly looked exactly like what he was, a failed businessman desperate enough to steal from his daughter's fiancé. Margaret's wine glass trembled in her hands as she read through documents that laid bare their family's financial desperation. I offered them a choice. They could sign my agreement, accepting full financial responsibility for their demands, or I could walk away from their daughter and their problems entirely. The wedding was 3 weeks out, deposits were non-refundable, and 200 guests had already made travel arrangements. Updated. The reaction in the comments is exactly what I expected. Lots of questions about Sarah's role in all this. To be honest, that's the part that hurt most. I'll explain more about how she handled everything. But first, do you think I was too harsh in my approach? Or should I have just walked away completely? Sarah's response when I told her about the meeting was enlightening. She accused me of embarrassing her parents, of being vindictive and small-minded. Not once did she acknowledge that they'd tried to steal half my business, or that they'd been lying about their financial situation for months. Her priorities became crystal clear. Protecting her family's reputation mattered more than addressing their betrayal. The next 2 weeks were hell. Sarah alternated between emotional manipulation and cold fury, demanding I apologize to her parents and agree to some modified version of their original prenup. She suggested a compromise where they'd only get 25% of my business, as if reducing the theft made it acceptable. Her parents, meanwhile, hired their own attorney to review my counteroffer. The poor guy had to explain that my document was ironclad and would indeed make them personally liable for millions in potential business debt. They could pursue their ownership demand, but only by accepting catastrophic personal risk. The pressure campaign intensified as the wedding approached. Margaret called my mother, suggesting I was having pre-wedding jitters and needed family intervention. Richard contacted my business partners, fishing for information about company finances while painting himself as a concerned future father-in-law. Sarah's friends were enlisted to convince me that I was being unreasonable and jeopardizing our future over paperwork, but I held firm. Every conversation, every guilt trip, every attempt at manipulation only reinforced that I was making the right choice. These people viewed me as a resource to be exploited, not a family member to be welcomed. 3 days before the wedding, I made my final decision. Not the one they expected. The morning of our wedding, I arrived at the venue early, with David and 2 witnesses. The Silverado resort had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, exactly the kind of expensive perfection that had been draining the Whitmore's accounts for months. Sarah was in the bridal suite, surrounded by bridesmaids and her mother, when I requested a private meeting with her parents. Richard and Margaret exchanged glances but followed me to a quiet conference room overlooking the vineyard. I placed a single document on the mahogany table. Not the prenup they wanted, not the liability agreement I'd proposed, but something entirely different. A comprehensive waiver of any future claims against my personal or business assets, to be signed before the ceremony proceeded. The document was simple and devastating. By signing, they would forever relinquish any right to pursue my company, my property, or my earnings through their daughter or any other means. In exchange, I would marry Sarah and maintain the family harmony they claimed to value so highly. Richard's face turned purple as he read the terms. Margaret actually stood up and walked to the window, her composed facade finally cracking completely. They had minutes to decide, sign the waiver, or explain to 200 guests why the wedding was cancelled. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on me. They'd spent months trying to force my signature on their terms, and now faced the same impossible pressure they'd applied to me. Sign or lose everything. Their daughter's marriage, their social standing, and any hope of accessing my resources. They signed. Both of them, with shaking hands and barely contained rage, while David's witnesses documented every detail. The entire process took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. Updated, final update, and wow, thank you all for following this journey. Some asked what happened with Sarah. I'll wrap that up. But the real question is, when someone's family tries to steal from you, are you obligated to protect their feelings, or do you protect yourself first? The wedding proceeded as planned. Sarah walked down the aisle in her $10,000 dress, looking radiant for the cameras while her parents sat in the front row wearing frozen smiles. To the guests, everything appeared perfect. Exactly the kind of elegant celebration the Whitmores were known for hosting. But the dynamic had shifted permanently. Richard and Margaret could no longer treat me as an outsider they could manipulate. Every conversation, every family gathering, every holiday carried the weight of what they'd attempted and how completely they'd failed. Sarah and I lasted 6 months. The marriage couldn't survive the foundation of deception and greed that had nearly prevented it from happening. She never forgave me for humiliating her parents, and I never forgave her for enabling their attempted theft. We divorced quietly, with none of the drama that had preceded our wedding. The Whitmores eventually lost the Atherton mansion anyway. Richard's business collapsed completely within a year, and Margaret had to take a job managing someone else's vineyard. They'd spent so much energy trying to steal my success that they never addressed the problems destroying their own wealth. My company thrived without their interference. Sometimes the best business decision is protecting what you've built from the people who claim to love you most.